All right, so this will be the replacement for yesterday's class. So this week, basically going to be combining modules 5 and 6. We'll go through modules 5 pretty quick. I'll mention some of this on Thursday's class, but let's get started. So we've kind of already talked about some of this stuff already, just in a different context. So we had this term of allocative efficiency when we talked about with the production possibilities curve. So we said the production possibilities curve told us something about the costs of producing more of the x-axis good. We said behind the scenes, we could determine what the allocative efficient point is if we had some knowledge about what the marginal benefits were. All right. So there we go. So when we're thinking about having this right side, there we go. So when we were thinking about that, what we were saying is to get more of this x-axis good, there was going to be some costs. And as we produce more and more of something, the costs were increasing. Now, we also said that when you have more and more of something, the additional benefit you get from each additional unit, well, the very first unit I have a good X is really beneficial, but that marginal benefit, as I have more and more of it, is declining. We then said this allocative efficient point is going to be, I will choose to buy something or produce something as long as that marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. In fact, that'll be true up to this point, and this would be the kind of allocative efficient quantity. Well, we should notice this looks very similar to what? Well, we were talking about a market, what represented marginal cost? That was just our supply curve. And with marginal benefits, that was represented through our demand curve. So really this allocative efficient point, it's very similar. I mean, really, for right now, we can think of it synonymous with the idea of the equilibrium, right? So we kind of already talked about this. So this idea of allocative efficiency is going to be where total surplus is going to be maximized for the market, right? Before we were talking about for the economy, here we're thinking about individual markets. So we already talked about demand representing marginal benefits, supply representing marginal cost. We'll choose to, something will be produced and bought on the market as long as the marginal benefit of that unit is greater than or equal to that marginal cost, okay? So essentially, our allocated efficient point is that equilibrium. So we're going to talk about a couple things. We talked about surpluses and shortages before, so let's not get it confused with this. This term surplus, right? We're now going to think about, maybe a better way of thinking about it is it's like the net benefit. So here we're going to think about what is the net benefit to consumers, okay? So it's going to be the difference between their marginal benefits and their marginal costs. So consumer surplus is going to be the difference between the marginal benefits and what's the marginal cost to consumers, the price, right? So total consumer surplus would be if we looked at every single person's surplus or every single unit that's purchased on the market, what was the difference between the marginal benefit and the price of the consumer, right? So what that's going to look like visually is going to be the area underneath our demand curve, right? That's the difference, that's representing marginal benefits, and the price is representing their marginal cost. So the difference between the two, that just represents consumer surplus. Now we're going to add up the difference between the marginal benefits and the price at every single unit, right? So another way of thinking about this is going to be like, okay, if I've got my demand curve, which represents marginal benefits, and I'm now thinking about a market where here's my equilibrium price, right? For every single unit here, like thinking about the first unit, the marginal benefit is above the marginal cost to consumers. So here, when we're thinking about producer surplus, you can almost think about the price represents the marginal cost to consumers, and the marginal benefit is represented by the demand curve. So for this unit, here was the consumer surplus. For the next unit, here was consumer surplus, the next. Essentially, this entire area under the curve, but above our equilibrium price, this is going to represent our consumer surplus, okay? Now, I'm going to jump the gun a little bit before we look at it on the, let me see, I can kind of keep as much of this on the screen as possible, right? So we're going to think about, we also have who else in our market? Producers, right? So we've got consumer surplus here. Oh, I'm running out of room. Here we go. Yeah, let's adjust this a little bit. There we go. All right. So here's our supply curve. Here's our demand curve, representing the marginal benefits to consumers and the marginal cost to producers. Now, if we think about this market being in equilibrium, right? That equilibrium price represents what? To producers, it's going to represent their marginal benefit, right? The price is a good thing if you're selling it. Right? So here, where would producer surplus be? Well, for producers, we're going to think about what is producer surplus. It's going to be the difference between their marginal benefits and their marginal costs, which really, this is just represented by the equilibrium price and the supply curve. So for every single unit, the kind of net gain or the net benefit to producers is, well, how much was I selling the good for? How much was it costing me? Next unit, how much could I charge for that good? How much was it costing me? So producer surplus ends up being the entire area above the supply curve, but underneath that equilibrium price. Okay. Now, this is not a technical way of remembering it, but consumer surplus is always going to be on top as we kind of work through some of these models. Producer surplus always going to be on the bottom. Okay, once again, not technical, but that is one way to kind of quick and easy remember it. Okay. So if we think about instead, I'll come back to this, producer surplus, right? It's going to be the difference between the price and the marginal cost, or the price and our supply curve. We kind of already looked at this. And, the technical formula that we're using, it's going to be for every single unit, we're taking the difference between the price and the marginal cost and then adding them all up. That's what that summation sign means. So, with more complicated curves, we'd have to be doing some integration here. But you'll notice when I'm looking at producer or consumer surplus, it's just going to be, with these linear supply and demand curves, a nice triangle. Right? So if I think about wanting to calculate this, right, how would I calculate consumer surplus here? Well, it's the area below my demand curve, because that represents the marginal benefits, the difference between that and the price I'm paying for the good as the consumer. So here, how do I find the area of a triangle? It's just 1/2 times base times the height. This isn't crazy geometry here. So what's the height of this triangle? It goes from 100 to 40, so 60. What's the base? Goes from 0 to 50. So 50 times 60 is 3,000. But I have to remember this is a triangle, so I also need to multiply it by 1/2, giving me 1,500. Right? So not too crazy to calculate these consumer and producer surpluses, at least initially, before we have government intervention. It's just going to be the area of triangles. I could think about if I had a producer surplus example. All right, oops. Well, I guess my animation's turned off, but how would I find the area of producer surplus here? Well, it's the difference between the price that they can sell the good for, that's their marginal benefit, and then their marginal cost represented by the supply curve. So it looks like here the height of our triangle goes from 20 to 70, so 50. Base goes from 0 to, well, what is that? 50. So 50 times 50 times 1/2, because it's a triangle, we get producer surplus is 1,250 here. So you'll notice in these two examples, these were in the same market, but in any situation, producer and consumer surplus don't have to be the same. In fact, quite often they won't be. And some of the examples we'll work through in this video, I keep them the same just to kind of make it easier, but they don't have to be. Okay? So, we've got producer consumer surplus, thinking about what this represents. It's really like the net benefit, right? So, you think about maybe the marginal benefit to a consumer would have been 3,000, or sorry, would have been 4,000. They would have paid up to that amount. The equilibrium price is only 3,000. So they had some additional surplus there, right? They would have paid even more if they didn't have to, right? The equilibrium price was lower than their marginal benefit. For producers, you think about, well, maybe they would have produced something or supplied something to the market for only 1,000. So if they're getting an equilibrium price of 3,000, they're liking that as well, right? They would have, right, supplied this for a much lower price, right? They're getting something that's 2,000 above what they would have supplied it for. Okay. So that's really, honestly, in a nutshell, module 5. That's why I've combined module 5 and 6. We're just thinking about how do we measure these net benefits to producers and consumers, and we call that net benefit surplus. Okay. So we've got a couple government policies that can kind of mess up, mess up these surplus values, or if we're not at the allocated efficient, when we're at the allocated efficient point, that's where total surplus is maximized. Government intervention is going to reduce that total surplus. Right? So we've got things like price floors, ceilings, quotas. We won't quite get to quotas in this video, but price floors and ceilings for sure. We'll then on Thursday talk about quotas, also taxes and subsidies. We want to know, how does each one of these government policies impact the efficiency of a market? Or how much does it decrease our total surplus from that allocated efficient point. We'll also be concerned with not only the loss of total surplus, but how is it going to impact consumers and producer surplus. Before we get really into them, kind of one thing that comes out of all of this is anytime the government gets involved, at least in these basic models that we'll start out with, they're going to cause what we call deadweight loss. So all deadweight loss is the loss of total surplus relative to that allocated efficient point, or when this market is being what we call perfectly competitive. Okay. The government getting involved makes the market not perfectly competitive. So the first thing we'll talk about is price ceilings. Right? So one thing you can think about with price ceilings, if you think about the ceiling of a building, what does it prevent? It prevents you from going any higher. Okay. So a price ceiling is going to say you can't charge a price higher than this amount. Right? So a price ceiling, when do we see it used? Well, tries to prevent price gouging, right? If it's saying this is like a maximum price, you can't charge a price any higher than this. Maybe we want to use this if we think, price of gas is too high and that people can't get to work and our economy's not, maybe we want to kind of limit the price for a barrel of oil, right? Or what, not, this isn't really how it happens in practice, but, we want to limit the price for a gallon of gas. So some other examples, you'll see rent controls, right? If we think rent is too high, we might want to say, look, you can't charge rent any higher than $500 a month, right? Or if we have raw materials in times of war, we want to make sure that, we can buy or have plenty of those materials to produce tanks and whatever else we need for these proxy wars. But that's the idea, right? We'll kind of set this maximum price for these goods, right? Now, this sounds good in theory, right? Especially if we're thinking about who is this probably going to benefit? Well, if I'm saying you can't charge a price, say, above $2 for a gallon of gas, well, that's going to benefit consumers and probably hurt producers. But how is that going to happen, right? So here I've got kind of a basic example, then I'll kind of draw one out. But let's say we had rent controls, right? And we're thinking about currently the equilibrium price of rent is $1,000 and 2 million apartments are being rented, right? There's 2 million being supplied, 2,000 being demanded, right? We get to this allocated efficient point where total surplus is maximized. So what is total surplus? Well, we talked about consumer and producer surplus. Total surplus is just the sum of those two, right? So this entire area would represent total surplus in this market. Why? Because it's the difference between the marginal benefit and the marginal cost of every single unit. Okay? So here's our total surplus. It's composed of two things: consumer surplus, which we said was the difference between the marginal benefits to the consumers and the price they're paying. What's producer surplus? Well, there, the benefit is the price that they're able to charge for their good and the difference between that and their marginal costs, right? So we've got our total surplus maximized. This market is freely operating at will, no government intervention. The government then comes in and says, okay, well, look, $1,000 is way too expensive for an apartment. We're going to limit it to $800. So they come in and they impose this price ceiling. So we'll talk about in a second, and I'll draw out kind of why it wouldn't work. But with a price ceiling, the only way it's effective is if I set it below whatever the current equilibrium price is. Imagine if I didn't. So let's say the government came in here and told everyone, you know what, you can't charge more than $1,200 for an apartment. The current equilibrium is $1,000. So everybody in this market says, okay, we're not, right? We're only charging $1,000. So any price above the equilibrium would be what we call an ineffective price ceiling. Okay, it's not going to have any impacts. Right? The government incorrectly set this price, set it too high. Now, if they set an effective price ceiling that's below the old equilibrium, so kind of think about it. Remember, a ceiling doesn't let us get any higher, so it doesn't let us get up to that equilibrium price. So what's going to be true here? Well, at this lower price, for every unit here now, producers, their marginal cost is above the price they can get away with charging. So is it profitable, or would the net benefit be positive for them? No, it'll be negative for them to supply these to the market. So producers stop at this lower quantity. Okay. At this lower quantity, what's our producer and consumer surplus? Well, producer surplus is going to be the difference between the price they can charge and their marginal cost. So notice producer surplus is a much smaller area than before. Right? Now, what's consumer surplus? Well, here's their marginal benefits. Here's the price they're paying. Consumer surplus is now this entire area but it stops at this quantity because no one's supplying these, even though people would be willing to buy these apartments, nobody is supplying them. So consumer surplus is just going to be that area there, right? So we've got producer and consumer surplus. Now we can also think, what does this rectangle, this part of consumer surplus represent? Well, it was once, before the government came in and got involved, it was producer surplus that has now become transferred over to consumers, right? So we might think, okay, consumers are definitely going to be better off, right? However, consumers lost a little bit of surplus here relative to before, and then producers lost this amount of surplus and this amount here, right? So because these units are no longer being produced or consumed in the market, all of this surplus that we had before is lost, or what we call deadweight loss, okay? So this is going to be kind of how these price ceilings work, right? Now it looks like initially they might be benefiting consumers. We'll kind of look at a model here in just a second where it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So we know that they're always going to hurt. These price ceilings will always hurt producers, but they can actually hurt consumers as well. So what is that going to look like? So kind of go here. I'll draw this out for you. So let's say we've got this market. And here we go. So we've got supply, got our demand curve representing marginal benefits, marginal costs. So let's say the government comes in and sets a really extreme price ceiling. So something like this, right? How could it maybe make producers and consumers worse off? Well, notice, what's producer surplus now? The difference between the price and the marginal cost, it's only positive, right? That difference between the price they can charge for an apartment and their marginal cost, it's only going to be positive for these quantities down here. So after kind of this price ceiling, the quantity we see is much lower. Now, where would consumer surplus be? Well, there's no apartments being supplied past this point. The difference between consumers' marginal benefits and the price they're paying is now this area here. So you notice this is kind of small relative to before. If they were at the equilibrium price, all of this would have been consumer surplus. So it can be the case that if we set these price ceilings too extreme, both producer and consumer surplus go down, in which case what happens to our deadweight loss? Well, if both of our individuals are losing surplus, our deadweight loss, our loss of total surplus, is going to be the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs for every single one of these units that would have been produced if we just left this market alone. So kind of notice here, our deadweight loss is much larger. Consumer surplus didn't go up, and producer surplus definitely went down. Now you can actually take this to the extreme. What if I had a price ceiling that was down here? What would total surplus be? Well, at this price, nobody's going to supply anything to the market. The market goes away. We lose everything, right? Consumers are worse off. Producers are worse off. We have this huge deadweight loss. Okay. So when we use price ceilings, producer surplus is definitely going to go down. We're not really sure what's going to happen to consumer surplus. If we set too extreme of a price ceiling, it could go down as well. In the slide, the model I had in the slides, it looked like maybe it went up a little, because even though they're losing a little bit of surplus here, they gain some that was transferred from producers. But we definitely know that deadweight loss is going to go up when we set these price ceilings, right? It's going to go, before the price ceiling, deadweight loss is 0. So after we set it, we're going to have some amount of deadweight loss. Okay. All right. So that's the general idea there. Go back to thinking about these price ceilings. So effective price ceilings, I already mentioned this, it has to be set below that equilibrium price. If we don't, it doesn't change anything, right? If I tell people they can't charge less than $2,000 for something and they're currently only charging $1,000, okay. Sorry, I tell people they can't charge above $2,000 for something, they're currently charging $1,000, they're like, okay, I'm not. Nothing changes, right? Now, what can happen? So if we think about the rent control model, not only do we have deadweight loss here, but what does this really represent? These 0.2 million people now don't have a place to live, right? So what happens if we don't have, 0.2 million people don't have a place to live? Well, people might start renting out apartments kind of not through legal terms or legal routes, right? If you think about really what do you do with like a price ceiling, if you like make something illegal, you're saying that it can't be sold, that you can't have a price at all. Well, what happens? We see black markets pop up, right? So that is, yeah, so that should cover it there. Oh, one thing we didn't talk about is it also causes shortages, right? So I'm going to come back to this slide in a second. But if we had kind of binding price ceilings, right, what's going to happen is if the government comes in and sets this price ceiling, notice what's true about my quantity supplied at this new price relative to the quantity demanded. So when this market is in equilibrium, quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. We don't have a surplus or a shortage. With a price ceiling, our quantity demanded is now greater than our quantity supplied, so we would have a shortage, right? So we'll have shortages with these price ceilings. They'll also cause, we already kind of looked through this, consumer surplus will now be the area of A, B, and C. So consumers had surplus before of A, B, and this little triangle here. So they lose a little bit of surplus here, but they've gained some from this area C. So they can be better off. We said we're not sure, right? They can be better off. They might not be. Depends on how extreme this price ceiling is. However, producers are definitely going to be worse off, right? The new producer surplus is the area underneath the new price that they can charge and above their marginal cost. So their surpluses definitely went down. And then all of these units relative to that allocated efficient point, suppliers now stop supplying this good to the market at this lower quantity. So all of these units here, what was the surplus we missed out on? That difference between the demand and the supply curve, or the marginal benefits and the marginal cost that existed in this market. So we lose E and F. This would be kind of our deadweight loss. You know, I won't specifically ask you about this like in a question. I would just ask you what deadweight loss is. But notice here, E is going to be the deadweight loss that came from consumers, and F would have been the deadweight loss that came from producer surplus. Okay. So there's different ways of kind of looking at these things. We can also calculate the value of these surpluses. So it gets a little bit trickier than when we had a market in equilibrium, because if the market was in equilibrium, consumer and producer surplus were just two triangles. Right? If we have a price ceiling here, it gets a little bit more difficult. So before, if we didn't have this price ceiling, what would our consumer surplus be? What was the area above the equilibrium price? That was the cost to consumers. Oops, I didn't want to do that. Hold on. There we go. And the area below their marginal benefits. So above the price, below the demand curve, or the difference between consumers' marginal benefits and the consumer's marginal cost, which is the price. So we had what? A height of 40, a base of 40, 40 times a half, right? That was 800. Now, what was consumer surplus after this price ceiling? Well, now at this lower price, suppliers stop supplying this good to the market at that quantity of 30. So now for those 30 units that we're seeing being produced and consumed, consumers, here's their marginal benefit. Here is their new marginal cost to consumers, or what's the marginal cost to the consumer? The price. So the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost to consumers would be this entire blue area. We now have a little bit more work to do because we have the area of a triangle and the area of a rectangle. So the area of this triangle is going to be what? 30 times 30 times a half. And then add to that, we've got a rectangle, so length times width, right? So 20 times 30, right? And we would just kind of add those two together. So we can see here, here's a situation where this price ceiling actually increased consumer surplus. Now, what was producer surplus before this price ceiling? Well, at the old equilibrium price of 50, producer surplus would have been the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to producers. What's the marginal benefit to producers? The price of 50. What's their marginal cost? That's just represented by the supply curve. So this triangle here would be what? Height of 40, going from 10 to 50, base of 40, 40 times a half. They also had producer surplus of 800. So this is a scenario, I made them the exact same. It doesn't have to be the case. Now, after this price ceiling, what is producer surplus? Well, the new price that they can get away with charging is 40. So the difference between that and their supply curve would just be this little green triangle here. So what? Height of 30, base of 30, 30 times 30 times a half. Producer surpluses went down after this price ceiling. How do we calculate deadweight loss? Now, if I didn't give you this visual, we could calculate deadweight loss. How? Well, deadweight loss is just going to be the loss of total surplus after this government intervention. So notice here, before the government intervention, our total or our consumer and producer surplus was 800. So our total surplus would have been 1600. After this government intervention, consumer producer surplus 1050, 450, add those together, we would have total surplus of 1500. So how much surplus was lost? 100. But I could also use this visual because deadweight loss is going to be the difference between the supply and demand curve, or the marginal benefits and the marginal cost that existed in this market, for every single unit that's no longer being supplied to the market because of this price ceiling. So that would just be this area, this little red triangle. What's the height? 20. Base goes from 30 to 40, so 10. 10 times 20 times a half, sure enough, gives us that value of 100. Okay. So that's how you would calculate consumer producer surplus after a price ceiling is imposed. So I've got some questions in here that I'll kind of probably work through at the very beginning of next class, or maybe at the end of this video if I have some time. So that's price ceilings, right? So the other thing that we talked about in my other section that we didn't have to cancel class for was price floors. Right? So here, if we're thinking about price floors, things are going to operate kind of it's not quite the exact opposite of a price ceiling, but a lot of things will be the opposite of what a price ceiling did, with the exception of price floors are still going to cause deadweight loss. Okay. So a price ceiling was saying this is the maximum price you can charge. You can't go above this, right? Like the ceiling stops us from going any higher. A price floor is going to stop us from going any lower. It's going to say you can't charge a price below this value. Okay. So when you think about a price ceiling is like a maximum price, a price floor is like a minimum price. Okay? So the prime example we have of this is the minimum wage, but theoretically we could put a price floor on anything, right? Sometimes this would be industries that we think need help. We want to make sure that the price they can charge for their good is a little bit higher, and so we might set a minimum price. Right? So an effective price floor, the exact opposite of a price ceiling, it has to be set above the existing equilibrium price. So this is kind of counterintuitive, right? An effective price ceiling has to be set below the old equilibrium, and the effective price floor has to be set above the old equilibrium, right? Now, the reason why is because the floor prevents us from going any lower. So maybe a way of thinking about this, when we had an effective price ceiling, we said, okay, that has to be, if I set a price ceiling anywhere up here, I tell people you can't charge any more than this. Well, they say I'm not. So all of this was like ineffective, right? The only way I had an effective price ceiling is if I set it such that it prevents, well, ran out of room. If it prevents the price from getting up to that equilibrium point. For a price floor, I'll make this a little bit more complete here. If I had a market, nope, I'm writing too fast. And here's the old equilibrium price. An effective price floor. Well, if I say, look, this is the minimum price you can charge. You can't charge a price any lower than this. Well, in that market, they're like, okay, I'm not. So any price in this range would be an ineffective price floor, right? The only way we can have an effective price floor is if we set it above the equilibrium. Thinking about if floor prevents us from going any lower. So an effective price floor doesn't allow us to go down to that old equilibrium. Okay. So that's kind of the idea of these effective price ceilings or effective price floors. Okay. I'll draw out this, well, here, I can kind of stack these. So a price floor, we think about what is this going to do in our market? So let's say I come in, I set this price floor. So with our price ceilings, we said the equilibrium quantity in the market kind of fell because it was no longer as profitable for producers to provide that good to the market. With a price floor, what's going to happen if it's effective? Well, now for consumers, any quantity past this point, the marginal benefit to consumers is now below the price they have to pay. So their net benefit would be negative. So why would they choose to buy any of these goods or any of these units? They won't. So with a price floor, we still end up with a quantity that's below our allocative efficient or our equilibrium quantity. But now it's not because producers stop providing it to the market, it's because consumers are no longer willing to buy it. Okay. What's going to be true at this price floor? Well, our quantity demanded here at this price is now less than our quantity supplied. So anytime we have quantity demanded being less than the quantity supplied, we say we have a surplus. So here's where it gets kind of a little tricky with terminology. When we talk about the relationship of quantity demanded, quantity supplied, this is a surplus in the number of units, right? We're talking about producer and consumer surplus. Their surplus is like the net benefits to those producers and consumers. So price ceiling, we said we end up with a shortage. Price floor, we end up kind of with this surplus in units. Okay. All right. So, and we already talked about the ineffective price floors. So kind of we'll look at this here, and then I'll draw one out for us. But let's say we have a market in equilibrium. Kind of what would the old consumer surplus be? Once again, not a technical way of remembering it, but consumer surplus is always on top, producer surplus always on the bottom. So when you think about before, this area of A, B, and E, this was all consumer surplus, right? The difference between the price that consumers were paying, that was their marginal costs, and the difference between their marginal benefits, the demand curve. For producers, what was the surplus? Well, for them, the marginal benefit of selling something is the price. So the difference between their marginal benefits and their marginal cost, represented by the supply curve, would be this area of C, D, and F. Okay? So here, without any government intervention, total surplus is this entire area, right? A, B, C, D, E, and F. It's maximized. We're at this allocated efficient point. Okay? In fact, just to kind of show why this is the allocated efficient point, I probably could have done this earlier, but I think this might help a little bit. So if I've got my supply curve and I've got my demand curve, why is this the quantity that total surplus will be maximized at? Well, let's think about, we know that if we end up at lower quantities, well, there, I'm now missing out on, right, that difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost of this good in the market. I'm missing out on some surplus. But what about if I had went past this point? Well, now what happens? Well, for units past this point, what's true about the marginal benefits to consumers and the marginal costs to producers? The costs are higher. So anything here, this would actually be like negative total surplus in the market. Even if you think about like the price being here, right? So if our price was here, well, for producers, their marginal cost is above the price. That's like negative net benefits. For consumers, the difference between the price and their marginal benefits, well, now the price is above their marginal benefit. This is like negative total surplus. So here we would just be losing out on surplus relative to if we just stopped at that quantity. Okay. So let's go back. So we had this market in equilibrium. What happens if we have a binding or an effective price floor? If I can get this to, there we go. So an effective price floor has to be set above that old equilibrium price. We said, what's that going to do? Well, at this new price, quantity demanded, the point we're at in the demand curve, is less than quantity supplied. We have a surplus in the number of units. But what's going to happen to our consumer and producer surplus? And then what is deadweight loss going to be? Right? Well, consumer surplus afterwards is going to be the difference between the marginal benefits to consumers and their marginal cost, which to them, the price is their cost. So the difference between the demand curve and the price is now just this smaller area of A. So we can see that relative to before, right, where we said consumer surplus was A, B, and E, consumer surplus went down quite a bit, right? So price ceilings, right? Thinking about the price ceiling was preventing the price from going higher. Well, that's going to be a good thing for consumers, but a bad thing for producers. A price floor prevents the price from going any lower. It keeps it artificially high. So that's going to be a bad thing for consumers, but a good thing for producers. So where will producer surplus be? Well, it's going to be the difference between their benefits, which is the price they can now charge for this good, and their marginal cost represented by the supply curve. So notice now producer surplus is the area of C and D, which that was part of producer surplus before, but now part of what used to be consumer surplus is transferred over to producers. So they kind of gained this area of B. Now, they did lose a little bit of surplus, though, from these units that are no longer being consumed on the market, right? Produced or consumed in the market. So what was deadweight loss? Well, if the quantity stops here, right, people stop buying the good past this number of units, the difference between our demand and supply curve, that represented total surplus. So here, the total surplus lost would be this area of E and F. Once again, I wouldn't kind of push you this far to identify it, but part of deadweight loss is coming from what used to be consumer surplus, and part of it is coming from what used to be producer surplus, okay? All right, so just like with price ceilings, we can calculate these, right? So let's think about before, right? What would consumer produce? So I think I use the same values here. Hopefully it makes it nice and easy. So without the price ceiling, the equilibrium price, where would supply be equal to demand at 50 and quantity of 40. So how would I find the area of this triangle? Well, the height, it goes from 40 to 90. So sorry, 50 to 90. So 40 goes from 0 to 40, 40 times 40. It's a triangle. So I then need to multiply it by 1/2. So that should be 800. What would, oops, producer surplus have been before? Just kind of jumping the gun here. Probably should change my animations. Well, it's going to be the area below the price that producers can charge, but above their marginal cost. So the area of this triangle going from 10 to 50, so 40 times 1/2, producer and consumer surplus both start out at 800. After we have this price ceiling, the government comes and says, okay, the old price was 50, but we're not going to allow the price to go any lower than 60. We're trying to help out the producers in this market. What's that going to do? Well, now at this higher price, nobody here, their marginal benefit is now below the price they'd have to pay. None of these consumers want to buy this good. So the quantity stops here at 30. What is consumer surplus? It's the difference between the marginal benefits to consumers, represented by the demand curve, and the marginal cost to consumers, which is essentially just the price they have to pay. So this blue triangle here would be our consumer surplus. So what? 30 is the height, 30 is the base, 30 times 30 times 1/2. We can see that consumer surplus with a price floor has went down. We already talked about before, consumer or producer surplus was 800. What is it after? Well, now after the price floor, the benefit to the producers is the price they can sell the good for. So here, 60. The difference between that and their marginal costs, which are represented by the supply curve, now becomes this entire green area. So once again, just like with price ceilings, I have a little bit more work to do, a little bit more geometric areas to find. I've got the area of a triangle. So what? Height is 30, base is 30, so 30 times 30 times 1/2, but also plus the area of this rectangle. So 20 times 30. So add those together. I see here that producer surpluses went up. Okay. Now, once again, even if I didn't have this graph, if I just had this information, I know what deadweight loss is. Why? Because deadweight loss is just the loss of total surplus after this government intervention. So what was total surplus before? Well, consumers and producers both had surplus of $800, so 1,600. After this price floor, consumers had 450, producers 1,050. So the total surplus there was 1,500, or we lost $100 of surplus. Now, if I have the visual, I can reproduce that by, it's simply going to be my deadweight loss is all of the surplus that I'm missing out on by being at this lower quantity, right? By not being at that allocated efficient quantity. What's total surplus in the market? The difference between the market's marginal benefits and the marginal costs, or just the area in between my supply and demand curve. So this triangle, this red triangle would represent our deadweight loss. Height is 20. Base is going from 10 to 40, sorry, 30 to 40. So 10 times 20 times a half gives us that same value of 100. So different ways of kind of finding our deadweight loss there. You can always do it using that visual, but if you know the total surplus before the government intervention, and then you know the total surplus after, that difference between the two will just be your deadweight loss. Sorry, I had to take a drink. So got some more top hat questions we could kind of work through. Like I said, I might kind of throw that together at the very end, but here's kind of a way to remember price controls. A binding price ceiling, it's almost like it's, like I said earlier, counterintuitive. A binding price ceiling has to be set low, right? You can kind of think about it as like the lower the ceiling is, right, it's going to prevent you from getting up higher to that equilibrium price. A binding price floor, it's preventing you from going lower, getting down to that equilibrium price. And so it has to be set above that old equilibrium. Okay. At this point, got one more thing I want to work through, but there we go. Let's think of a slightly different context for price floors, because where we see them used most often, and we want to talk about these in economics, is the market for labor. So just like the market for any good, you can think about workers are really a type of good, right? It just gets a little bit weird. So if we think about quantity of labor and like the price of labor, we generally call the price of labor wages. So if we've got the price of labor being wages, we could think about there's going to be some demand for labor, right? The first worker I hire in my company has a really high marginal benefit. I then hire kind of the next most effective worker, then the next, and the next, and the next, so on and so forth. There's also going to be a supply of labor, right? People willing to work for lower wages, right? Or you could even think about this as an individual. Initially, you would kind of give up an hour or two of your day at a relatively low wage. By the time you get to like giving up the 12th hour in your day, you're going to want higher wages, which is why we see things like overtime, right? As I provide more hours of labor, or supply more hours of labor, my marginal costs are increasing. In order to convince me to work that 11th and 12th hour, you're going to have to pay me a higher wage. So just like with any market, we would then see an equilibrium price or equilibrium wage and an equilibrium quantity of labor. So let's say the government comes in and sets an effective price floor, right, in this market. What is that really doing? So I'm saying you can't pay people anything less than this wage, or I set a minimum wage. So with this minimum wage, what's going to happen? Well, at this higher wage rate, all the workers here, or all the labor hours here, to the companies, they're going to have to now pay a price that's above their marginal benefits. Are they going to do that? No, the net benefits to them, or the surplus to them past this quantity, have now become negative. Before, at that old equilibrium wage, the difference between their marginal benefits and what they were having to pay their workers, it was positive, so they chose to go up to this quantity. After the price floor, we're now going to see, I'm just going to call this PF for price floor, a lower quantity. Right? Now, what does a lower quantity of workers mean? These people no longer have a job, or they're unemployed, right? So we now have, fewer workers being hired. Now, minimum wage sounds good, and this is where it gets kind of weird, because the demanders of labor, usually when we think about who's demanding products, that was like you and me. I think that's like we can kind of think through our lens. And then supply used to be like companies. But when we're talking about labor, who is actually demanding the labor? That's the companies. Who's supplying it? That's us, the workers. So we said price floors are going to negatively impact consumers. Well, the consumers of labor here are companies. So politically, that's a little bit easier to kind of impose this price floor in this market because we're hurting the companies, right? What's happened to producer surplus? It's now going to be the area below their marginal benefits, but above their costs. What are their costs now? This higher minimum wage. So producer surplus at the old equilibrium would have been this entire triangle. Now it's just this smaller area. Now, another reason why politically it's easier to push like for price floors and minimum wages because it's going to help workers, right? Because notice what's true about consumer surplus here. The marginal benefit to workers now, the price that they're getting paid, it's a higher wage. Here's their marginal costs. So I'm labeled these, I'm talking too much. Here was our consumers, right? Consumer surplus is always on top. Here, producer surplus is always on bottom. So our consumers were the companies, so their surplus went down. Producers, these were our workers, so their surplus actually now went up with this price floor. So benefits the workers, hurts the companies. This is politically something that's kind of easy to push through. Just like price ceilings are a little bit easier to push through because if we go back to those models, we said with price ceilings, let me get the old picture just since I'm referencing it. Who were we hurting? We were hurting the producers there, right? Who are the producers? Companies. We could be hurting consumers, but in some models we showed we can help consumers. So price ceilings are a little bit politically easier to push through. Price floors in the labor market are a little bit easier to push through, right? And then just like always, anytime we have government intervention, we no longer see any of these units being produced and consumed in the market. So we miss out on all of this surplus, or we have some deadweight loss. So we can kind of think about in the context of the labor market, who's benefiting from these minimum wages? Well, anybody who keeps their job, the difference between their benefit, the wage they're receiving and their marginal cost, it's now higher than it was before, right? Higher than what it was at that old equilibrium wage. However, everybody here who no longer has a job, they're not going to like this. Right? So, we're thinking about it's kind of a delicate balance. We know that some people are going to lose their job. Other people are going to see a gain in surplus. So hopefully, if I was doing this correctly as the government, I would probably trying to get people to vote for me. I'd make sure that there was more people in this category where, oh yeah, this minimum wage made my life better than people in the category where this minimum wage caused me to lose my job. So trying to put a little bit of a real world kind of context into what we're doing here. First time I think maybe I touched on the labor market in an earlier class. I try not to go too in depth into this because I know it's a little bit tricky because, like I said, the people demanding labor become the companies and the people supplying become you and me. But this is a perfect application of a price floor is the minimum wage. Okay. Just to kind of prove the point. So notice here, like the way I kind of drew this, producer surplus, did it go up here? Well, I lost a little bit of surplus here, but it looks like I gained more. So it was kind of offset. So it looks like producers overall are better off. Think about a really extreme scenario. Now, I don't think we'll ever get to this point, but just for the sake of thinking through these things. So we've got our supply of labor, our demand for labor. Let's say I came in and I set a minimum wage all the way up here, right? This is my price floor. Right? At that higher wage, what's going to be true? Even that first worker, the marginal benefit they bring in to those companies is less than the wage they'd have to pay them. So what does our quantity go to? 0. What would deadweight loss be? The entire total surplus of that market. Right? Now, I don't think anyone's ever, government's not going to do that. It doesn't really make any sense. But that's the idea. If we did set too extreme of a minimum wage, we actually could eliminate this market altogether. Then what's going to happen? Well, if I can't legally, I can't, even that first unit, if I have to pay that legal minimum wage, I'm not even going to supply that first unit. What might we see pop up? Black markets, which in labor context, paying people under the table, right? So just kind of extreme sometimes helps solidify some of these issues we're talking through. So that should kind of summarize it. So we think about, what are some of the unintended consequences of these binding minimum wages? Well, it's going to decrease our quantity demanded for labor, increase our quantity supplied. If the demand for labor is less than the supply, that's essentially unemployment. We might see that if you raise the minimum wage, maybe it's no longer profitable for me to hire workers, and I try to replace them with machinery, right? If the cost of machinery is relatively lower compared to that minimum wage. Maybe I relocate to countries without this, without these laws. Maybe it's not just the number of workers goes down, but in my model, I said we can think about the quantity of labor also being the number of hours. So maybe I just have the worker, instead of working 8-hour shifts, maybe I'm lower it down to 6. Right? Now, there can be some positive effect of minimum wages. I didn't get through that with my other section, so I'll kind of hold off and save that for Thursday's class. But right, $15 minimum wages, we would see unemployment everywhere. Okay. I didn't do quotas. Oops. So what I want to do here is work through some problems. So let me get this pulled up, and then I will share my other screen with you. Actually, here. All right, so this should be good to go. So this will be for, there we go. So I think you can see this now. Hold on. No, it's not what I want. I want you to be able to see. Okay, you can see this now. So these are the problems I worked through at the end of class. Pretty easy. These are going to be the top hat questions that you go on and answer. If I had a market like this, equilibrium price is 50, what would my consumer surplus be? It's just the area between my demand curve and that price they're paying. So the height of that is 50, that triangle. The base is 40. 40 times 50 is 2,000. It's a triangle though, so I still need to multiply it by 1/2. 2,000 times 1/2 is 1,000. So if you're watching this video, hopefully everyone gets these easy top hat questions correct. I'm giving you the answers here. Producer surplus, that's just the difference between the price that producers can charge for their good and their supply curve, or their marginal costs. So here that would just be going from 20 to 80, right? So 60 times what's the base? We went from 0 to 60. 60 times 60 is 3,600. It's the area of a triangle though, so we still need to multiply it by half. 3,600 multiplied by half would be 1,800. And then kind of the final one, if I had a price floor of 70, oops, what is the deadweight loss associated with this? So at this new price of 70, and actually, I don't know if I said price floor, I think, yeah, price floor. Consumers, their marginal benefits are only above that new price up to this new quantity of 20. So before, in equilibrium, where would supply be equal to demand, it was at this quantity of 40. So what surplus did we lose out on? It was the entire difference between our supply and demand curve, right? Or all of this surplus that we lost out on because we're no longer seeing these units from 20 to 40 being produced and consumed in the market. So there, the height of that triangle would be what? 30 to 70, so 40 times, what's the base? We're going from 20 to 40, so 20. 20 times 40 would be 800 times a half, should be that value of 400. Okay, so that wraps it up kind of for this video. We'll be back. Oh, there we go. We'll be back in class on Thursday, kind of picking up where we left off, talking about taxes, subsidies, and quotas.